All right, this week we're looking at Chapter 17 by Kazez titled We Should Prohibit the Use of Chimpanzees and Other Great Apes in Biomedical Research. She starts off by talking about how in July 2010, the fate of 200 chimpanzees living on the Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico, became a topic of heated U.S. debate. In particular, the proposed transfer of these chimps led to reintroduction of the Great Ape Protection Act, or GAPA, which was initially introduced in Congress in 2009 with 160 co-sponsors. This wasn't the only sort of thing that had been used, because all primates, comprising about 20 species, already receive extra consideration under the Federal Animal Welfare Act, and under the Chimp Act, which was passed in 2000, chimpanzees came to be favored in another way. Still, with these 200 chimpanzees bound for Texas in this big transfer, animal advocates were focusing on the plight of these animals, and pro-research organizations did their best to redirect attention to humans who could benefit from continued research. So in the section on apes, art, and trees, Kazez says that, look, if you think it through, we value art and trees and fast driving enough to let more people die so that we can have them. Do we also care about chimpanzees to that degree? In fact, she says more and more people do, in fact. But why? Why do so many people who are informed attach some special value to chimpanzees? Well, a couple reasons. First, they're our closest non-human relatives. Chimpanzees have a great deal in common with us psychologically. Likewise, chimpanzees can also be taught rudimentary sign languages and other kinds of communication. And also, chimpanzees are endangered species. So, call this argument, based on these cluster of reasons, the value to us argument, says Kazez. This argument is the most cautious and conservative argument that can be made for this particular legislation called GAPA. But there's other kinds of arguments which could be used. Is that all we can say? The argument we just used, called the value to us? Nope. The argument so far ignores an important fact about apes. Unlike paintings, apes can suffer. Apes have preferences. We can look into the eyes of chimpanzees, and we can feel compelled to do things on their behalf. We seem to have obligations directly towards them. The fact that apes can feel and want, and that we must do things for their sake, could strengthen the case, says Kazez, that she's made so far on behalf of the GAPA. Now, as much as certain philosophers' opinions are interesting, she's going to try to set aside a couple of unusual positions, meaning those of Descartes and Kant, that convince nearly nobody today. Instead, we will assume here the common sense picture. Animals do suffer, and they have other morally relevant mental states as well, such as preferences, and these things directly give rise to obligations in us. Putting all that in a nutshell, you might say what we are assuming is that animals have rights. But she quickly qualifies this. Rights talk is open to many different interpretations. Ethicists who think animals have rights in a stronger sense have in mind what are often referred to as human rights. Now, there's a lot you could say about this, but one of the things Kazez points out is that we, human beings, are speciesists. And she doesn't mean that politely. Speciesists, the term speciesist is using a term that entered English in the 1970s. The idea here is we have a deep-seated bias in favor of the human species and against other species. Now, thinking this through, she says this: with all of this in mind, we can now look more closely at our obligations to animals and whether they allow us to use the great apes for research. Then, we will consider whether we ought to extend strong rights to animals. Okay, so this is a multi-layered argument. You don't have to accept each layer in order to accept the one that comes below it. So in the section titled Our Obligations to Animals, she asks, what obligations do we have to animals? Perhaps this is the predominant view of what our obligations to animals are. We may do just about anything to them that meets our own wholesome needs and desires, but we must not inflict more harm than is integral to meeting these needs and desires. Now, she says, our thinking about this should consider 4 issues. First, how severe is the suffering that we're causing to the animals? Second, what's the probable outcome of the research? Third, what's the way of balancing the kinds of harms to animals like chimpanzees and the kinds of benefits that are likely to come to humans or other animals? Fourth, what is the nature of the subject species? Right? Some animals have a different lifespan than others. Some animals have more consciousness than others. It should be obvious, says Kazez, that thinking along these 4 lines is close to thinking like a utilitarian. Why? Well, a utilitarian says that an experiment on animals is permissible just in case it produces the greatest possible balance of benefits over cost, taking into account all affected, including sentient animals. But the main difference between this approach and utilitarianism lies with the question of balance. Okay, utilitarian says we should aggregate the costs and benefits that will come from performing an experiment, but some of the examples used in the earlier part of the section suggests that that's not quite simple enough. Now, one of the things that Kazez points out in this section is that we should continue the system that permits research on chimpanzees only if the living conditions for the apes and all of the experiments thereby sanctioned are likely to pass muster, and that's extremely unlikely. Why? Well, to begin with, there's no such thing as green-lighting just a rare, justified experiment. And she explains why. You usually are justifying a whole slew of experiments. Furthermore, oversight and transparency are very limited. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, or what are sometimes called IACUCs, these committees that oversee animal research, as mandated by the United States Animal Welfare Act, are actually made up of insiders who are not neutral and autonomous judges. Then there are some worries about the possible pointlessness of some of the medical experiments. So, consolidating this, the value to us argument gives people like us one reason to support the GAPA legislation, and consideration of our obligations gives us a second reason. But are we thinking in the right terms? She says, instead of adopting a set of moral criteria that's close to utilitarianism, would it make more sense to extend full rights to apes? Okay, so here's the third section, the third kind of argument. Are there rights that apes have? Well, extending rights to animals, or some animals, like extending human rights to animals, right? Human rights are thought to give humans a sort of inviolability that imposes enormous limits and obligations on others. Okay, now, extending such rights to animals would lead to a very simple and a very straightforward defense of GAPA. But is this extension plausible? Well, she points out that perhaps the most frequently made argument for the rights of animals is something called the argument from marginal cases. The idea here is, let me see, oh, I didn't highlight that, but I'll highlight it right here. The common denominator in these types of arguments is this: humans can have robust moral rights even if the humans are not well endowed with the capacities that we prize most highly. Okay, so think about babies. Think about elderly people with severe dementia. Think about people with cognitive impairments. We often think, hey, those kinds of humans already do have rights, even though they don't have reason or self-awareness or creativity or things like that. So think about a non-human animal that's in a similar kind of cognitive situation. Right? Imagine someone named Chuck, who is a chimpanzee with the same mental abilities as someone named Dawn, who Kazez imagines is a human being that has very limited mental capabilities. So assume, for the sake of argument, that you've got a chimp and a human, and they both have the same cognitive abilities. That's the sort of case that they're trying to ask you to compare. Okay? If this argument is sound, we should have no more use of the great apes in research than we should use against the impaired children of human beings. Now, this is a popular argument. Despite the initial appeal of the argument, Kazez thinks the argument for marginal cases is shaky, and she explains why. A very different sort of argument, so a second kind of argument for the rights of apes, takes a direct approach. First, explaining what gives rise to basic rights in typical adult human beings, and then leaving children and people with impairments out of the picture. So don't worry about the babies, don't worry about the people with cognitive difficulties. Let's focus just on the typical case of a normal adult human being and see what gives those folks the rights they have. So on this approach, having rights is a question of meeting a certain threshold, and the argument is that the great apes meet the threshold, even though the great apes have much less of each critical power than a normal human being does. Now, do animals really meet this threshold? How strong is this kind of argument? Well, Kazez says at this point in time it's hazy where the threshold is, and we're also not so sure about what the relevant abilities are when it comes to human beings. Interestingly enough, though, there is a scholar named Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist with a lot of esteem for apes. He rejects the rights approach. As much as he cares for apes, he rejects the rights approach. He says, what if we drop all this talk of rights, de Waal says, and instead just advocate a sense of obligation? And that's what Kazez had done in the earlier part of the argument. Okay, so what ended up happening to these Alamogordo chimpanzees? She gives a little snapshot of what happens. Eventually, the U.S. National Research Council of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies was asked to study the scientific necessity of using chimps in medical research. And on December 15th, 2011, the National Institutes of Health announced results of the study it had commissioned back in January. What happened is that the authors of this study used current research, or they looked at current research that involved chimpanzees using their criteria, and here's what they concluded. Here's a direct quote. While the chimpanzee has been a valuable animal model in past research, most current use of chimpanzees for biomedical research is unnecessary, based on the criteria established by the committee, except potentially for two research purposes. And I think those were monoclonal antibodies and possibly hepatitis C, okay, although that was a little more controversial. The authors of that study ended up writing, the present trajectory indicates a decreasing scientific need for chimp studies. But clearly, these authors of that study rejected a ban, acknowledging the possibility of necessary research in the future. Is this progress? She concludes by saying the NIH chief, Francis Collins, accepted the advisory panel's recommendations, and he announced that while the NIH determines how to implement these recommendations, all United States experimentation on chimps will be suspended. Now, if these recommendations are perfectly put into place, Kazez says the changes will represent significant progress, but I and many animal advocates will still have to object because, she says, I believe the value to us argument warrants a total ban on chimp research.